My name is Nancy Dillette, and I'm an academic associate at Arizona State University and an oral historian. Today is February 19th, 2010, and I'm continuing to interview Arizona City County Management Life members for the ACMA Oral History Project. Today I'm interviewing Fred Carpenter. Mr. Carpenter began his career in town management in Guadalupe as an intern in 1975, and then went on to be town manager for Prescott Valley and Buckeye, Arizona. And then he made a hiatus to serve as city administrator in Heston, Kansas, then back to Arizona in the position of town manager in Wickenburg, and finally in Payson. And coincidentally, he's also now running for town council in Payson, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, at the end of our interview this morning.
Sure.
We're documenting the history of life members in order to share the values and principles of people who created the council manager form of government, and in this case, its relationship with the League of Arizona Cities and Towns, and ACMA. We're in Mr. Carpenter's home in Payson, Arizona, and this is interview number 19. And we're going to go fairly chronologically, but I'm going to start off and ask you where and when you were born.
Okay, Seattle, Washington, back in 1946.
And tell me a little bit about what some of your early life was that led you to your first job or to your Master's of Public Administration at ASU. How did you first get an interest in serving maybe in public administration?
Well, it's kind of an interesting background, I guess, maybe. Or everybody comes to this profession in different ways, and I actually have an undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering that I took from ASU in 1969. And of course, at that time, as soon as you graduated from college, they wanted you in the U.S. Army. So I spent a couple of years in the Army. When I came out, engineering was completely on the skids. There were no jobs available, so I took a job in an intercity youth project in Phoenix. Worked 4 years for what was called then the Loretta Young Youth Project. Actress Loretta Young funded it to start it off, and I worked for that organization for 4 years, and that came on hard times. Everything seems to come on hard times. And I had the GI Bill available to me, and I said, well, gee, it might be interesting to go into public administration. I was always interested a little bit in political science, I thought. Of course, I knew nothing about government. And so in 1975, I went to school on the GI Bill, and I went to the ASU Job Placement Center, which a lot of people do when they want to work part-time. And they sent me out to the town of Guadalupe, and I got interviewed there, and next thing I know, I'm an intern there. And so I went to school full-time, what was then the Center for Public Affairs. It's now, I think, called the College of Public Programs. In fact, I knew Dr. Frank Sackton, who just recently passed away, quite well. It's an interesting story, kind of a sidelight to all this. He, as you know, was a 3-star general and once worked in the Pentagon, and was really quite an accomplished individual, but he had problems with statistics, believe it or not, and I tutored him in statistics, which is, he always used to tease me about it. He'd come to, various city manager meetings or League of Cities meetings, and he'd say, oh, there's my tutor, he thought it was funny. Because, in spite of all his grasp of all these bigger issues, that was one blind spot Frank had, but what a great guy.
Huh.
Anyway, so I spent 2 years getting my master's degree there, and ended up with only 1 B in the entire 2 years, which I think was pretty good. The rest were A's, of course. I should have said that. And so by the time I was getting my degree in 1977, a full-time position had opened up in Guadalupe. So sometime during, and I forget the exact chain of events, I became an administrative assistant, they called them. And of course, in government, administrative assistant is actually a professional position. Unlike in the private sector, it's oftentimes considered sub-professional. But anyway, I did all the budget work and grant writing and stuff like that. Well, political winds blew against my boss, and he went away, and the new boss needed an assistant. So next thing I know, I'm the assistant town manager there.
Well, talk a little bit about what was going on in the town of Guadalupe in the mid-1970s.
Well, it's interesting because Guadalupe just incorporated in 1975. And it had just incorporated like in May of that year, and I went to work there in September. So we're literally building that town from the get-go. And Bill Hernandez, who, I don't know if he's on any of your list to talk to, probably not. Because,
Not yet.
but he's a great resource if anybody wants to learn about Guadalupe, because he was born and raised there and came back as, hometown boy makes good, but political winds, the town was at that time quite divided, and there were two factions, and political winds blew against him, even though he was a hometown boy, and they ousted him. So it's, I don't remember all the ins and outs of that, of course, but.
So do you remember anything about the original incorporation time? Was that a tough negotiation in terms of setting boundaries and?
Well, I don't think so. It started off, there's the Highline Canal that runs along the north edge of what was then the north edge of Guadalupe. And they annexed a little bit up to Baseline Road, a very smart move, because now on the south side of Baseline Road, there's a lot of good commercial that gives them a good tax base. I tried to talk them into it when I was there. They didn't go along with it, annexing I-10. Because, if you have I-10, you can actually go out there and patrol it, and you can actually gain some revenue off of the speeders out on the highway. But they never did annex it, and I always thought that was a mistake, because when I was in Buckeye, which is part of the later story, we achieved a lot of revenue from the highway, from I-10.
So what were some of the things that were issues for you when you were working as administrative assistant in Guadalupe? At
Well,
the
we were
time?
trying to
Some of the
get
issues
grants for everything in the world, because Guadalupe basically just had to start from scratch, and it didn't have much of a tax base, so it wasn't going to have a whole lot of revenue. So grants were a really big thing. So we spent a lot of time getting grants.
Federal grants?
Federal grants, mainly through MAG. We went through MAG for most of those, and we had help from then Senator Dennis DeConcini with the sewer system project. I remember that. And it was all, everything had to be built from scratch there, and they had one area of town, this was a big issue while I was there, one area of town had a separate water system. The neighborhood called Senda Vista had a separate water system, and Tempe had the water for the rest of the town. And so finally, Tempe was able to go through, it was a rather painful process. They were able to buy out the Senda Vista Water Company, and now I think Tempe provides water for the entire community now, which is a really better situation, because the private company did not have, it had to exist on local wells, and a lot of those were high in salt content, and water just wasn't that good. That was one of the really big issues there when I was there. And then another big issue was, we did from my practicum, from my master's degree, I did a housing survey of Guadalupe. And it's still on file somewhere, I'm sure, at ASU. You could find it if you wanted to. And that's where we did a lot of interviews of elderly folks there. And
Okay.
got a lot of historical background. But, we had to do this housing survey. We found out that something, I don't remember the numbers exactly, but an extremely high percentage of the homes were substandard at that time. And I think it's improved some, but I would still bet it's still quite a lot of it is substandard. But the idea was, if you get a housing survey done, then you have the database you need to go apply for things. And so it was something I did while working that I was able to turn into a master's degree project.
I'll have to look that up, actually.
Yeah.
Just as an aside, I'm gathering information about the Yaqui community.
Oh, yeah, I have a little
So
bit
this would be
insight into
terrific.
that, sure.
Okay.
Some definite insight into that.
Yeah.
Back when I was there, it was something like, I don't know if I'm getting the numbers right, 60 some odd percent Mexican American and 30 some odd percent Yaqui, and then 2% other. And I was never one of the other. I never lived there, even though I worked there. I always lived in East Phoenix at the time. But so, and the Yaqui community is really quite fascinating. There's more than one. Of course, there's the Pascua Yaquis. They actually have their own reservation. And for years and years, the Guadalupe Yaquis were trying to get a certain area declared as a federal reservation, and I don't think that ever got accomplished. They had an area called the Bean Colony that is kind of a southeastern part of Guadalupe that was reserved supposedly for something to happen like that, but I don't think it ever did. You probably know more about that. And I remember, this is another incident I remember that you're going to absolutely love. There was I don't remember the young man's name, but there was a reporter for the Tempe Daily News. I don't know if it still exists.
No, I don't think so.
Anyway, I think it was called the Tempe Daily News, and he wanted to take pictures of the Easter ceremony. And of course, they have an ordinance against that.
Right.
He went out there and, actually took the pictures, and he actually was arrested and
Good.
fined, and he expected the paper to back him up, but they wouldn't. They just let him they didn't help him out at all, they just let him, but he was doing it for First Amendment considerations, that he could have a right to film this, but apparently the ordinance held up. It's kind of an interesting incident.
Yeah, the ordinance is fairly well posted there.
Yeah, it is. And, it kind of freaks people out a little bit that you can't, take pictures of something, but anyway, I guess it's probably still in effect, isn't it?
I think it is, absolutely, yeah. You can be invited, and there are certain areas you can attend, but you can't, I don't think you can photograph or
Well, his theory was,
gain access to the whole thing.
his theory was to test the First Amendment issue. And he apparently didn't win it, or he didn't get enough backing to win it, so.
Yeah. So, okay, let's move on. I'm
One
sorry.
thing real quick, would you mind putting your drink on the floor rather than on?
Oh, sure.
So every time that you put that on there, just the mic is going.
I was picking it up, okay.
Sorry, it's just a little
We will
sensitive.
try not to.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, so let's move on beyond your first experience then at Guadalupe. So you're kind of in the right place at the right time when you get that internship and
Right,
it
it all
moves
kind-
into
Right,
assistant
it moved into something,
administrator.
and it moved into assistant town manager, because the person they hired really didn't know too much about governmental budgeting, and so he wanted somebody to do the budgeting, and so there I was, and I was doing the budget every year there. And at that time, the folks in Prescott Valley, I've got a fascinating history in Prescott Valley to talk about too. I
Okay,
think
let's
it's
go
fascinating
there
to me.
next.
But they were looking to incorporate it, and of course, when you do that, one of the things you do, or at least I don't know if they still do, but it's a wise thing to do, you go around and talk to communities where they recently incorporated. So these folks came down from Prescott Valley and had dinner with the Guadalupe Town Council, and I happened to be in on that as to give them, provide information and stuff like that. Well, next thing you know, they want a new town manager, and so I ended up getting hired as the first town manager in Prescott Valley. And I started there on October the 30th, I remember it very well, 1978. That was my first town manager job. And they had 1,800 people in Prescott Valley at the time. I don't know if you've been there lately, but it's close to 40,000, I think, last report. And it's changed dramatically. You wouldn't recognize it from the way it was back then. But, so I started off there on October 30th, and I have a couple of fascinating tales, which the person that are involved in it are long deceased, so I don't think it'll offend anyone, but there were a couple council people that voted against me being appointed. And one of them would never talk to me. During the first 3 months I was there, would never even speak to me. So I went up to him one day and I said, I don't even remember his name. I said, well, why won't you talk to me? He said, well, my neighbor told me that you're in the mafia, that you were brought in by Prescott Valley Incorporated, which was the private developer, to put this town in shape, and, you're a criminal element and all this. I'm just laughing, And I finally got through to him that, I didn't have anything to do with any of that. I was a local government professional. That was my thing, But he thought I was in the mafia.
Wow.
So it was crazy that was a very bitter incorporation battle up there. And it happened in August of 1978, and the developer, called Prescott Valley Incorporated, wanted the town to incorporate, so basically it could get out of the way, let somebody else deal with it. They sold most of their lots, but they still had some responsibility for going out and making sure things were working, and they really didn't want that to happen. They wanted to get out of it. They're developers. And a lot of the streets there are named Warren Drive and so on, and there's some connection with Ned Warren in Prescott Valley. I don't know exactly what it is, but many of the streets are named after his children, I'm told. Especially in what's called Unit 1 of Prescott Valley, which is right near the highway just the north side of the highway.
And for the people in the future who will read this who maybe aren't aware of Arizona's history so much, could you talk a little bit about?
Well,
Ned
I don't
Warren?
know too many details, but Ned Warren had a reputation as being a developer of somewhat questionable ethics. Now, I'm choosing my words very carefully because I don't know anything. I'm talking about reputation.
Okay,
True or false, I'm not going to say.
right, gotcha.
But there was that reputation there. And
So when you came into Prescott Valley as their first town manager, was that literally at the very start of incorporation, or had
Well,
they begun the process?
it had incorporated
Okay.
already. They had the election in August, and then they had to go, they knew they had to get the town started, they had to have somebody come in and quote unquote start it. So I had to basically open the first bank account, establish an office, hire a secretary to take care of, do bookkeeping and all that. And
What an amazing opportunity for you.
it was tremendous. And then start building a set of codes from scratch. And, you have to have a building code. You've got to get your zoning ordinance adopted. And that really takes quite a long time. I mean, it's not as simple as it sounds. And yet you have to do all of that. See, they luckily incorporated in August. So Yavapai County is still responsible for providing services in there until the following July 1st. But you've got a lot to do in that 8-month period, from the time I got there. Basically November 1st till July 1st, 8 months, we had to get everything up and running.
And when you say we, who was we?
Well, we as the town council, they have to make the actual decisions, but somebody has to guide them and put all the pieces together, make it all fit. And so, I was town manager, town clerk, finance director, personnel director, all those things. Human resources we used to call them personnel director, human resources manager, they call them now. But, all those things had to be done. I mean, it's like working from scratch. So, kind of
I'm
fascinating.
sorry, just to go back, so were you serving as all those things, town clerk?
I wasn't titled all those, but I had to
You
wear
were-
all those hats.
Right.
I basically
You
had to
weren't
do all those
actually
things.
able to hire staff to take those
Oh,
positions.
no, we
Because
didn't.
it was a small town at that time.
Very small. We hired, we were able to hire a zoning administrator later early in the spring. I think it was, I recall correctly. Some of these things you don't remember too well, and a building inspector and positions like that. And, we were able to do that a little bit later. But I continued to act as basically the finance director, human resources manager, town clerk, all those official things for all that time. I never took the minutes myself, but I always had a person at the meeting to take the minutes, and then we would transcribe them later, and I'd make sure that they came out, that they made sense, and basically dictate the minutes is what I would do.
And what was the relationship at that time when Prescott Valley first incorporated? How did it relate then to Prescott?
Well, not real well. Prescott was kind of upset at the whole thing, and they were really upset at one of the things that I did that I'm probably most proud of in my entire career. And Joel Shapiro, who was my planning director, and a really smart young man and really knew how to do things. This was before the open meetings law. And we did about an 80 square mile strip annexation there in Prescott Valley, and we just completely, in those days you could do them on an emergency. You didn't have to go, another 30 days. Now it's real complicated. You can't do strips. You can't annex anything more than twice its width, and it's just really longer than twice its width. So they outlawed the strips, but we did one there that was about 80 square miles, I believe, is inside of it. It goes way up north into past Coyote Springs and almost out to Mingus Mountain on the east side, and then clear back up to kind of almost just on the other side of Castle Canyon Mesa, if you're familiar with the area. It goes on that side. So all that stuff was then basically Prescott Valley's turf, and Prescott couldn't come in. And we did that really on an emergency basis at the last possible moment. We had one person who signed for the whole thing. It was kind of a neat thing, really, I thought. And so it basically shaped Prescott Valley to be the way it is. Us doing that was probably the most important thing we ever did.
So in retrospect, of course you'd never be able to do that now.
No.
But it totally shaped the future and the growth
I think so, yeah.
Prescott Valley and Prescott Valley's relationship with Prescott. There's
Right.
still
There's still a little bit of
some of that.
antagonism, I guess, between the two, but I actually got along well with the city manager up there. At the time, he was quite shocked and didn't speak to me too much for a while after that. But hey, we had to do what we had to do. I mean, and they understood that. To
How
protect
about
the
in
community.
terms of were there other issues, like water issues between the valley and Prescott proper? Or
No, not
did that
really.
develop later?
That developed much later, but the big deal was in about 1981, they decided they wanted to condemn the Shamrock Water Company. And that process dragged on for years. I don't know when they finally acquired it, but It was many years later, they actually ended up doing the acquisition. But, no, the water issues, that was the only water issue then, because the groundwater code had come into effect, and of course you had to go along with the 100-year water supply requirements and all that, if you're in an AMA, which Prescott Valley isn't an AMA, of course. So we had all that stuff to deal with, but most of the town was already subdivided. I mean, they had about 6 square miles completely subdivided there, and they used to say, and we used to laugh at the time, well, we can put 25,000 people here, and everybody would chuckle. Well, look at it now. I mean, it literally happened.
So who were some of your mentors at that point? Who did you go to as a young town manager?
Well, there's one particular person who used to be city manager of Goodyear, and he passed away in 1999, a gentleman by the name of Ernie Kleinschmidt. And when we get to Buckeye, there's an interesting story about Ernie Kleinschmidt and then town manager of Buckeye that's worth telling too.
Okay.
But we'll wait till we get to Buckeye for
Okay.
that one. But yeah, he's one of the smartest guys in the business, and especially in small towns.
Okay. So I'm just curious, looking back at talking to so many people who've now become life members, you're unusual because most of them are going from town management and then they want a little bigger place and bigger and bigger. And I think it's an interesting story that we're going to hear from you, that you continue to build your career in town management.
Right. And well, this is the biggest community I ever imagined. It's got 15,000 people, so it's not really a big city. So if you talk to people like Mike Hutchinson or something, he spent his entire career in the city of Mesa. I mean, from an intern till city manager,
So what made you shape your career in that way, in that kind of unusual way?
Well, it's a variety of factors. In town
management?
management, and this is true almost everywhere. I mean, there are rare exceptions, but you don't last too long in any given town too long because there's issues that come up. And Prescott Valley was coming up with issues, plus my wife wanted to move back down to the valley. She wouldn't want to now, but that was a different era. And so Buckeye came up, so I took that.
Okay.
And of course, at the time, everybody was saying, oh, Buckeye's going to grow. Well, I get there in 1983, and it's got 4,500 people or something like that. I leave in 1995, and it has like 5,000 people. I mean, just nothing. Entire 12 years I'm there, very little happened. But there's some stories about that are certainly worth relating.
Okay.
But, to be somewhere like that for 12 years was kind of remarkable. But we always thought it was going to grow, I'll just get the job will get bigger and so on, but it just kind of stayed the same. And once you get to a community, if you have kids, we said, well, we've got to get our kids through school. We're here and they're young, and my youngest son graduated in 1992. So, then we were done. I mean, then we could go somewhere else. We figured we'll just keep them in the same schools. And that's always a problem in our field is, you got families and you don't want to keep dragging them all over the place.
Sure. So when you come to Buckeye in 1983, what goes into your decision then to leave Prescott Valley? What draws you to Buckeye?
Well, I didn't really necessarily want to leave, but there were some council people up there that I just didn't get along too well with. In fact, one more Prescott Valley story that I think is one of the most fascinating stories, and it's absolutely true. You can check it out if you want to, but in about 1984, maybe it was 85, it was in that range, there was a mayor, an unpopular lady who was mayor, and she was running for re-election. And there was a former mayor who decided to run against her. And then there was a third gentleman, and a really unusual gentleman, nice guy, but kind of strange looking, had a Santa Claus beard and all this. So the election comes along, and about a month before, the former mayor, the one-time mayor, he dies a month ahead of the election. And of course, the election goes on, and she finishes third behind the person who died. That's how unpopular she was. And the other guy won it. I thought that was kind of fascinating. To lose to a dead man is not a real recommendation, I don't think, to you.
No.
Anyway, that happened after I left.
What kind of
it.
experience did you have then in terms of, so by now you've had 2 experiences working with 2 councils, first
Right.
in Guadalupe and then in
Prescott Valley.
And were they similar experiences or
No,
different?
not,
or
well,
what
the
did you
Guadalupe
learn about
Council I
working
never
with
worked
them?
directly for, but the Guadalupe Council had an absolute 5-2 division. I mean, if one of them said the sun rises in the east, the other two would vote no. I mean, almost that bad. I mean, and then that turned around, and then it became 2-5, and that's when the manager there got the heave-ho, and, you know, they brought in somebody else. In Prescott Valley, there was an incorporation group that was pro and an anti-group. And the pro had a little slight majority on the appointed council. Well, the minute they had the first election in 1979, that turned around and the anti-incorporation forces were in charge. Which, what sense did that make, really? I mean, they were against incorporation, but now they're running the show. So that turned into a 5-2 that direction, or maybe it was 4-3, I forget, but they had a majority. It's kind of fascinating.
Wow. So could you talk a little bit about your theory of how you began to relate and work with the councils and, you know,
Well, I don't know.
expertise you began to build up?
I mean, whenever I went into a new community and I just got there, I would always go and have an interview with each of the council members, try to learn what their likes and dislikes were, and, you know, what their goals were, what they wanted to see happen. You know, that was my theory. At least I started that in Buckeye. I didn't really do that in Prescott Valley because I didn't realize that you should. You know, you learn as you go along.
Sure.
I realized then that I should, so I started, you know, I would just interview them, find out what their likes and dislikes are. Well, when I get to Buckeye, there's a definite split there on that council too. I mean, it was like a 5-2 split. There were 2 people who thought one way most of the time and 5 thought the other way most of the time. Well, the first election comes along in 1984 and that flip-flopped again. Turned around into a 4-3 the other way, basically. Basic, you know, type of divisions. And I still don't understand a lot of those divisions, even though I lived there. I don't understand because some of them happened when these people were kids. You know, they were mad at one another and they just carried all the way through. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
And a place like Buckeye, which was an old established community, is quite a bit different than some of the other places that I've worked in. For example, Prescott Valley, nobody had lived there more than 5 years probably that was there.
Yeah, I'm interested in the difference between a place like Prescott Valley where everybody's moving from somewhere new and then you're gonna move and manage
Yeah, Buckeye is
with
totally
deep-
different.
Deep agricultural roots.
Absolutely, yeah, very deep agricultural roots. In fact, my older son married into those agricultural roots. It didn't last, but he married into it at one
To
point.
the cotton.
The cotton family, cotton farmers, sure, yeah. They
Which
had,
one, if I may ask?
sure, Henry was the last name.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you're familiar with it or not. In fact, my son's ex-uncle by marriage is mayor out there right now, Jackie Mack. So
So a very
I
different
know.
kind of community with.
totally different than Prescott Valley. I mean, just completely different. And it's just hard to describe how different it was. Operating out of it, just, I mean, we had our town hall was in a Dairy Queen, a former Dairy Queen. It was just incredibly, you know, bad, I thought. So one of the first things I got involved in there was trying to get a new town hall built. And we did that with a Maricopa County bond issue. We built a joint facility. I started on that in 1984, and it was like 1990 before we actually moved into it. It was kind of interesting, though. The county did this bond issue, and then they built the facility. And during the term of the bonds, they stayed in the facility, and eventually they turned operational control over to the towns. They did that in Gila Bend as well, I believe. And certainly did it in Wickenburg, because I was involved up there too.
So was this the point in time where you got involved and became mentored by Ernie Kleinschmidt?
No, I was getting
before?
advice from him in Prescott Valley.
Okay.
I'd call him up every now and then and get advice.
And why would you turn to him?
Well, he offered, you know, he was always, I mean, I used to see him at meetings when I worked in Guadalupe, and when I got the first job, you know, he knew me from going to grant meetings and stuff. He'd say, well, anytime you have any questions, give me a call. And so just about a year before he died, they visited us in Heston, Kansas, he and his wife. Kind of unusual. They were going to Indianapolis or somewhere, and we were sort of on the way. They went out of the way a little bit to go through there.
Yeah.
But
Okay, let's talk a little bit about your experience then. What do you have, 12 years in Buckeye, and you mentioned before that you were anticipating a big boom at that time. 'cause
Yeah, everybody kept
certainly
anticipating
Everybody else
it.
was growing.
Everybody else
East
was,
side.
and land was relatively cheap out there, and all the farmers, some of them were getting tired, you know, the new generation was getting tired of farming and said, hey, well, we'd like to sell and, you know, become something other than farmers, you know, and land would change and change hands, and, but nothing really ever happened. Sun Valley, are you familiar with that? I was involved in that one. That's some interesting stories you can tell about that. The Sun Valley Parkway, have you ever driven on it? It, originally, the way that was developed, the town of Buckeye annexed both sides of the highway and left the highway to the county. I don't know if that's ever changed or not, but, and they were going to, when the developers built that road, they thought, oh, Sun Valley's gonna develop right away, you know, and of course, it didn't. You know, in fact, then the real estate thing came along in the late 80s, early 90s, and it all blew up in their face. And a lot of people lost a lot of money, but anyway, it was 3 lanes. And I told them, I said, you know, it's gonna be a while before anything much happens. I go, let's make the 2 outside lanes bike lanes.
Thank you.
And
It's the
so I
best
was
biking in the valley.
I'm responsible for that.
Wow.
So you
I was
could,
just gonna say, the best thing on the west
I mean,
side to me is the bike lanes.
it was my idea that got that
Thank
going.
you.
So thank me, if you're a bike enthusiast.
It's amazing. So really, that was your
Yeah,
idea?
it was my
because you
idea.
could see the growth would be so far
I
out.
told the developer, I said, it's gonna be a while, let's make the outside lanes bike lanes.
Couldn't you do anything about the power lines overhead that crackle so much that it's a
No,
little scary when you ride?
There's certain things you can't do out there. But I was also served while I was in Buckeye, I'm pretty sure it was. I served on the, it was either in Buckeye or Wickenburg, I think it was Buckeye. I served on the bicycle task force to help develop all this bike system for the entire valley. It was kind of an interesting thing. We used to get grants and for different projects, and we did this big study, and I was the chairman for quite a while too.
Do you remember who you
The MAG
contracted
side.
with to do the study? And was it through
No.
MAG?
Yeah, I had 2
study?
experiences. I was the chairman of the bicycle task force as a MAG committee, but I also was on the county committee. The county had one, so I served on both of those.
Okay.
I used to be a big bike enthusiast myself. I used to ride all the canal banks in Buckeye, and, you know, out there's a lot of good places to ride.
Yeah.
There still are, but I mean, then it was even better. I had a mountain bike and I'd ride along the berm up there on north of I-10, you know, and the flood control thing up there. It's great.
So what were some of the other major things? Were there water, sewer
Well,
issues? What?
There was a big water issue that Buckeye had, and I don't know if they ever overcame it, but they have a CAP issue, or they did, of a decreasing allocation. And it always, I never knew the history of how that came about, but it was always troublesome. And water, the groundwater there is pretty high in salt content, so they had built a plant in 1962 for water treatment, and then we built another one in 1988 for water treatment, and using basically reverse osmosis type processes. And so water and sewer were big issues. The other big issue was no park facilities, so I was able to engineer that park that's on this kind of south side of town. Got that going. We got a new community center built while I was there. Sewage treatment plant was upgraded. Just did a lot of those that's the kind of thing I like to work on, because those kind of facilities are very important for a community. And just as I was getting ready to phase out of there in 1995, we were getting the grant for the swimming pool, which is there now. And I think that turned out really well.
So a lot of issues, just infrastructure
Infrastructure
as well as
issues.
community of life kind
Oh,
of issues.
and the Walmart plant, that was
Oh,
another
yeah.
really huge thing. We had to end up spending a couple $100,000 to get them to come in, because we had to extend water service out to them. But
Did
it
you have
turned
to compete with
huge.
another town or city to?
Yeah, we
attract
were, as a
Walmart?
matter of fact. That's a little bit of a funny story too. The people that were building it, they had a choice of Kingman or Buckeye. And it turns out they flew into Kingman in a snowstorm. And they said, nah, we don't want to be, of course, Kingman gets, 2 inches of snow a year? But it was one of those happy accidents that they were flying in a
Changing weather.
snowstorm. They said, oh, we don't like it here. So they went to Buckeye. And that place, of course, employed 400 or 500 people, just a tremendous thing. And then it was in some sort of a zone that lowered the property taxes for a few years, and I don't know what they call it, but some sort of a federal exempt zone or something. And then that expired, and of course now they get the full property tax from that, which is huge. So it's a great thing. The other thing I was really instrumental in getting going there is the Buckeye landfill, south of town. Huge revenue source for the town. Just incredible. And you don't have to do anything except collect a monthly check, you know? That's it. So that was, I thought, a really good deal. The Lewis Prison Complex was coming in just as I was there, and I remember one of my council members' wives was against it. She was afraid that, you know, her daughters were going to get raped by escapees and all this type of stuff. And I didn't laugh. I mean, I felt like laughing. Because I don't think anybody's ever escaped from Lewis Complex yet. And it's been, what, out there for 15 years or something. They've had some issues on the complex, but they've never had any issues from escapees. So I was, you know, in favor of it, because I knew that you'll get the head count off all those prisoners. You know, it's all part of your population count. You don't have to do anything. You know. And now that's the thing that Ernie Kleinschmidt taught me years ago. He, Perryville Prison, if you're familiar with it, was, he said, okay, we'll take it, but only if you let us annex it. Because he knew he'd get all that head count in his population.
Now, these are privately run prisons?
No, no, Department of Corrections runs them.
Okay. They still do?
Yeah,
Okay.
yep. Perryville was turned in, at one point, my son used to work there as a correctional officer, and he got out of that business a few years ago, but then it was turned into an all-women's prison. I don't know if it still is.
Okay.
I think it is, though.
So a lot of infrastructure, a lot of different ways of trying to bring in funds to the valley, but essentially the agricultural roots are still very, very strong, and places like Verado are not even on the charts yet.
No, not really, not even thought. Well, and Buckeye still, if you drive out there, it's still largely agricultural. I mean, in the main. I mean, it has those subdivisions up near the freeway, but when you get a couple miles away from the freeway, you still see the old Buckeye fields, cotton growing and alfalfa and such as that.
How about
Dairy
the
farms are
Caterpillar
gone.
operation? Was that,
That's where Verado is located,
Yeah.
of course. That was going in those days. You'd see the caterpillars actually climbing up the hill from time to time when you drove out to the West Valley. Interesting thing there.
Any other, you know, industrial growth or?
Well, we had very little. We worked real hard to get the airport built up. I mean, that was another one of those many things. And then I had a council at one point that didn't want anything to do with the airport, so we leased it out to a guy. The entire airport, lock, stock, and barrel, was leased out. Of course, the town maintained responsibility for the runways and that sort of thing, but he actually leased the whole thing out. A guy named Hans Lordson.
So during this time, you're also involved in MAG, and you're
Quite a
chairing
bit.
committees.
Yeah, I got involved in it quite a bit, and one of the things in 1988, I think it was, or 78, I was the vice chair of the management committee, and at the time, Roy Pedersen, who was probably on your interview list,
Yes.
he was the manager of Scottsdale, and he was the chairperson, but he was also high up in ICMA at the time, and he was gone for lots of the meetings, so I ended up virtually being the chair for 4 years there, because Roy was always gone. And so, you know, I would always have to take over. So I got a lot of experience doing that. My actual term, I think, was 88, 89, I think it's in there, I forget that, it's on my resume, but
Okay.
I forget
And
the
how
actual
about in
dates.
terms of service to ACMA? How did you rely on ACMA to help support you as a town manager?
Well, for us, it was a great source of networking. I mean, I would go to the 2 conferences every year, and in those days, we spread the conferences around an awful lot. I mean, we would go to a lot of different locations for the meetings, and we'd go to Douglas, and we came to Payson. I remember once we'd go to Pine Top Lakeside. They kind of settled in a few years ago, I think, to just going back and forth between Sedona and Tucson. At least they were doing that. I think they still do it because it's so nice at Dentona Cane. Everybody loves it there. And then the place in Sedona they go to too. But we would, in fact, one of the charms was we'd never, we'd always have to pick a different place to have a conference. And we stayed in the old Gadsden Hotel once back in the late 80s. And it was at that time being rebuilt. And it was pretty touch and go. I mean, it was pretty basic at the point we stayed there. But, they needed to have occupancy, of course, when you're trying to build something up.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's turned into really, I guess, a beautiful, completely remodeled hotel. So, and in those days, when you got on the board, you would start off as a director, and then you'd work your way through various positions, and it'd take you about 4 or 5 years, as I recall, to become president. We always had staff provided by, and originally MAG provided the staff for it, and then the league took that over. If I recall correctly.
That's right.
And so, to me, ACMA was really very important for networking,
Okay.
because you'd be able to get a hold of members, and I mean that was the real big purpose of it. And you'd go to meetings, and you got a lot more out of sitting around at in the bar. I mean, I don't figuratively or literally, you'd get a lot more out of doing that sometimes than you would out of some of the meetings. Because you'd ask people about how to deal with this issue, that issue, and they'd give you some great ideas.
Yeah.
And that's what it was really all about to me, networking.
Yeah.
And of course, a professional association also gives you a lot of legitimacy. If you're a member of an organization, you've been accepted, into it.
So was there a time where you thought at this point, because I know in your career, you then you get a little hijacked off of Arizona for a while. So talk a little bit about what went into the decision to leave the state, at least temporarily.
First and foremost, I came on hard times with the political structure in Buckeye. And the council had turned it actually into a 4-3 against me. And they were getting ready to let me go. So I decided one day, I talked to my wife, and we just said, well, let's just leave. I'll give myself 6 months. Because I've been there long enough where they couldn't just run me off. It would have been harder. They could make life miserable for you, but I knew a lot of people there. It wasn't going to be easy. So I just made an announcement one night that I was going to leave in 6 months. Well, it took, unfortunately, longer than 6 months to get another job. And so I was unemployed there for a while, but I finally caught on in Heston, Kansas, and started there in November of 1995.
So what were some of the issues, do you think, in retrospect? Or did you know then, or do you know now? Was it just the wind blew in a certain
personality
direction, or-
things, and there was people that just don't like you for whatever reason. Nobody ever gave me any good reason. There was one guy who I still would have absolutely no use for. He was a superintendent of schools, and he just thought he knew everything, and he wanted to run the city the way you run the schools. And of course, again, they don't translate, because you have a lot more policy issues to deal with and a lot wider variety of issues to deal with in local government than you do in the school district. I mean, yeah, you have plenty of issues, but they're much narrower. And he just I don't think he understood that really well. And he was just really not very nice. And then a couple other people got elected that were, for some reason or other, didn't like me. Who knows what? No, I don't know why. I mean, there are places you have some disagreement with somebody, and that's what causes it. But after 12 years, I tell you what, I was getting pretty tired of the place anyway, so maybe I wasn't doing as good a job as I'd done when I first got there either. But that happens, People get stale.
Okay, so let's move on to the Heston, Kansas.
Yeah, it's an interesting community, about 30 miles north of Wichita. And I don't know how familiar you are with farming equipment, but the Heston brand is a huge brand in the farm machinery business. You talk to anybody that does any farming, they'll tell you about the Heston brand. And the town was named after it, not named after Charlton Heston. In fact, it's not spelt the same.
I see there are 2 S's here.
Yeah, there's 2 S's in Heston,
Okay.
Kansas. And it's a...
Did they have similar situation to Buckeye? I mean, were you attractive to them because of Buckeye, or?
No, not at all. It was a
Buckeye?
totally different situation. Surrounded by farming, but just really not really related at all. In fact, they had the Heston Corporation, which has gone through several other names since, but it's still a large manufacturing plant inside the city. Only 3,500 people lived there at the time, and yet they have like 900 employees in this plant. So people are coming from all over to work in this farm machinery plant.
Okay.
Plus, they have a lawnmower manufacturing company there. Just a very good company, or a very good business, very good industrial town. And pretty well to do, actually.
So what do you think was
Comparatively speaking.
attractive about you to them to hire you at that time? What did they want to accomplish and
I
have you
think
do?
they saw somebody who'd, had a lot of experience, and they went through, they actually, I was in the second tier of interviewees. They interviewed some people, didn't find anybody they liked until they finally got me, and they liked me, and I went back there for 3 years. It was very difficult to live back there, though, for me, because Kansas is not at all like Arizona. I mean, the people are nice, they're real friendly. In fact, probably friendlier than overall than you meet out here, because most of them are not transplants. They've lived there their entire lives, And it's very nice the living conditions in that regard with the people are very nice, but it's flat, it's cold 5 months out of the year, literally, I mean, really cold. And then you're dodging tornadoes for several months, and I mean, it's never ideal like the weather we can get out here, weather-wise. And it's flat. I mean, if somebody who's used to living around mountains, it's tough to get used to that. You get agoraphobia living there. Because it's just,
More of same.
I used to drive 10, 15, 20 miles east of Heston just to see hills, because I like to see some hills.
So at this point, if you could weave a little bit in about, it sounds like by this time your kids had grown up.
Yeah, the kids
And
didn't move
so
back
they
there.
weren't an
No,
issue.
the kids were not an issue at that point, right? So we moved back there, and my wife didn't really like it there, and she had enough roots here to work, and she'd come out here and work for a couple of months in one of her old jobs, and she always came out here. She always picked, we'd go out there for Christmas, and she'd always stay until Washington's or President's Day. Leave me back there in Kansas where you wouldn't even see the sun for the entire month of January sometimes. Just, it's hard to believe unless you've lived there. It's hard to relate to.
So one of the things it sounds like in this position that maybe you didn't have before, a new experience was part of this downtown revitalization
Where in Heston?
in Heston.
We didn't really do too much there. The only thing I did there that I was really proud of, I was only there for 3 years, but one of the things I was really proud of was establish a signage project for directions, how to get around different things in the community. It was really turned out really quite beautiful. If you drive back there today, you'll see those signs, and they're just really nice. I was involved in that, but I was actually city administrator, which is different title than town manager. The mayor actually had to officially appoint people. But he always deferred it, because he didn't want to mess with that. He had a full-time job as a school teacher, So I would just say, well, we need to hire a maintenance worker, and I'd go, and he'd say, well, how about, I'd say, here's Joe Smith, he's well qualified. Say, fine, he'd sign off on it. Because he didn't really have the opportunity to spend too much time doing that. He had a full-time job. But it's a little bit different organization there. They have, instead of almost all Arizona cities, the smaller ones have 7 council members. They have a mayor and 6 council members. And there they had a mayor and 5 council members. And the mayor only voted in case of ties. So if somebody didn't show up for a meeting and it was a 2-2 vote, he could vote to split. He'd vote the other way. But of course, that didn't prevent him from expressing opinions and trying to influence the council to go certain directions that they wanted him to go. And he always did that. But
So you were only there a couple of years, but what kind of tactics did you use as coming from the outside in a
right.
place with long, deep, maybe not agricultural, but industrial roots?
Well,
How
the
did you
industrial
get to know that?
agricultural related roots,
Connected,
though.
sure.
Yeah, connected.
So
Well,
how did you, by that time, it sounded like you knew to come in and
yeah, I'd interview
everybody.
all of them, find out what they wanted, spend some time with them. And there happened to be one of the council members owned an auto repair shop, and one of them was an engineer at the plant. One of them was a teacher, and then one of them owned a hamburger stand there in town. And they were settled individuals that had been there most of their lives. So I don't know. I just came in with I was the outside expert, so I came in and told them some new things. One of the things I did that they really appreciated, they had a police chief that had been there for 17 years, and they, of course, were the ones that had to hire and fire. They wanted to fire him, but they didn't want any political backlash because they were afraid of that. So I told him, I said, look, I'll talk to the guy and I'll tell him what's gonna happen if he doesn't, if he doesn't decide to quit, this is gonna happen. And so I spent a couple hours with the guy and told him how the cow ate the cabbage and all that, and he resigned quietly. Actually called it a retirement. Saved them all kinds of political grief, and they were very happy with me over that. It was stuff like that that I knew how to do that they didn't know how to do, And at the time, the internet was just really cranking up, and so we needed to bring internet service in, so I made a deal, I engineered a deal with an internet service provider to bring in, internet service to the town, dial-up, of course, at the time. And the only way they didn't have any money to start up. So we basically made them a loan that they paid back over 2 or 3 years. And they made our office, actually they set up their ISP in our office at Town Hall. So I got into that sort of thing very early on. And I remember being fascinated that once it was up and running, that you could actually email documents back and forth. I mean, you remember how revolutionary that was. I mean, that was more revolutionary than faxing, really. And that was one of the most revolutionary things I'd ever seen.
How did it change how you administered?
Well, I don't know if
If
it
at
changed
all.
how you administered, but, the attorney, in the smaller towns like that, you always have contract attorneys. Well, he was 8 miles away in the city of Newton. Well, we'd always have documents you'd want to get back and forth. Well, it's always, you have to run down there and spend an hour, going back and forth. And instead of doing that, of course, now you can just email the document. It's great.
Amazing.
Put it on the agenda. So it was fun and in that regard. And actually, I didn't mind living there so much as we were away from family and friends and so on. That, and it was great to get back. Now, and when you're a member of ICMA, you agree that any place you go, you'll serve 2 years. But after that 2 years was up, I started looking, and I had a fascinating interview experience, which I'll tell you about as part of this too. I think the people involved in it are probably no longer around, so I don't know if it'll hurt anybody's feelings. But
Is this with
this coming
with
back out here.
Wickenburg? Okay.
Well, it involves Wickenburg, but
Okay.
not so much directly.
All right, well, we can move on to that, unless there's anything else you want to say about what you learned or how.
Well, I don't know if I
how
learned that
Heston-
much back in Kansas, other than the budget structures. A couple things are really fascinating about Kansas that are different. One thing there is you cannot sue a local government or any government in Kansas for more than $500,000, and I'm telling you that makes the entire world totally different. I mean, somebody gets injured on a sidewalk or something, they just pay it, and nobody tries to sue anybody or anything like that because they can't. And so it makes things so much easier to operate there. Now, they still have, of course, exemptions for federal stuff. I mean, if you have civil rights violations, you can still sue. But all the little stuff that cities and towns get sued for in Arizona for these incredible, exorbitant sums of money, it doesn't happen there. And so it makes life a lot easier for operating. And they have a budget year.
Why did that model not catch on other places, do you think?
Well, I'll tell you quite simply, it's the trial lawyers. And that's my humble opinion. They have pretty good lobbies everywhere. And the piece of 500,000 isn't as nice as the piece of 5 million that you can get out of somebody. I'm cynical about that, but I've been there.
Experience.
It's an experience. Of course, I won't name any names, but
We'll go off the record for that.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, when we've interviewed some of the other city managers, they've talked about the kind of unique aspects of the city manager situation in Arizona. But of
Right.
course, a lot of the original ideas came out of Kansas, from what I understand.
that could be. I don't
From
know.
public administration there and leaders there.
Oh, you mean as far as going back to the reform movement of the
Yeah.
early 20th century?
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps they did.
Yeah.
That I don't know.
But
But,
did you feel a distinct difference? I mean, you mentioned the one thing about the not bringing the large lawsuits. Did you feel a distinct difference in the form of the form that it took in Kansas as opposed to Arizona?
I don't think that much, really. I mean, I was called the city administrator, but, there are a lot of people there that have title city manager, and we basically did the same thing. Then there were places where they really stuck to the city administrator model, and the mayor would actually do the appointments and all that. But most of the people there I knew. I did have one several interesting experiences I think you'll find fascinating. There's a town there called St. Mary's, Kansas. City of St. Mary's. It's not far from Topeka. And I was at a conference one day, and I happened to know a gentleman in Buckeye who used to run the Buckeye Valley News by the name of Mark Shepard. And he was a traditional Catholic, Latin Rite Catholic. And he was one of those that were really upset when Vatican II came in. And so his kids got old enough, he only had a couple of them left, and he decided he was going to move to St. Mary's, Kansas, because they have a traditional Catholic they have a bunch of traditional Catholics, plus they had some sort of an academy where he could send his son, that would be taught with the Baltimore Catechism and all that. Well, I run into the city administrator of that town at the meeting, and we're talking about it, and he said, well, I've got two factions in town. He said, there's the traditional Catholics and there's the Vatican II Catholics. And he said, and I have a great time with them. They like me because I'm a Lutheran. I get along with both sides. So I thought it was kind of funny. Well, found out a couple years later he ended up getting fired there for some goofy thing, but at the time it was working good for him, to be both, because he could bridge the two sides. Some of those towns are like that back there. One of the things you find in Kansas that's a lot different is they're ethnic towns. There's a town of Yoder there, not far from, about 30 miles west of Heston, that's Amish. And the Kansas Highway Department builds a brand new 4-lane highway from Hutchinson to Wichita, and they put in underpasses for the Amish, which I thought was really neat.
Amazing, yeah.
Yeah, that was great. And Yoder has this carriage house restaurant. You go there and you eat all the old-fashioned foods and stuff, prepared, they're all dressed in the nice Amish costumes. It's great. There's a lot more, it's just different local color than you don't have here. The other thing that's interesting about Heston is now some of this may have changed, but in those days, Kansas has much different alcohol laws than Arizona does. In a grocery store, you can only buy 3-2 beer, no wine, nothing else but 3-2 beer. And Heston had no alcohol outlets at all. It was a dry town, not legally dry, but de facto dry. Nobody would dare come in and bring in a business. You go to a convenience market there, there's no alcohol. And the town had 5 churches, 4 Mennonite churches, and 1 Methodist. And the 4 Mennonite churches were all slightly different doctrinally. And I couldn't tell you all the differences, but just slightly different. And some of the bankers there love the Mennonites because some Mennonite sects refuse to take interest. So they put these exorbitant sums of money in the bank and they won't take interest on it. And I don't understand all of that. I didn't while I was there, but I know that some of them have certain beards are shaped a certain way and the women dress a certain way. And then some of them dress just like mainstream Americans. There's a college there too that's a 2-year college, but called Heston College. It's pretty widely known in the Mennonite community around the country anyway. So is this stuff interesting to you or relevant?
At the end of your tenure there.
Can I change the tape?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, and can I get something to drink?
Absolutely. Yeah, you've talked about a lot of this very itinerant. So you're expecting that's going to unfold in life.
Yeah, you actually do.
So that is difficult on a family and planning, long term ahead.
Sure, it is. And that's why a lot of folks that get into business, they follow the Mike Hutchinson model. They go to work in a city and try to work their way up, and that works good for some people. I just always liked the small town experience, and I like to be away from the metropolitan area. Because I love to go to Phoenix, don't get me wrong, it's lovely. But, most of the time I'd rather be up here.
So it really suited you personally and professionally.
Right, to do that.
To do that.
I never, from 1978 until, after I've never lived in a big city since 1978. And I'm glad of it.
So what's the impact? What do you think makes the career of somebody who does serve as town manager different from the city manager? It sounds like you have to perform a lot of different functions.
Well, you do in the smaller
kind of
places.
staff.
You take, up until I left Buckeye, I was always officially the town clerk, the finance director, the human resources manager. In Heston, Kansas, actually, I did have a city clerk there, which was great, and he did all the budget work. But I had to be a zoning administrator there too, which is fascinating. And it's nothing I really don't enjoy as much, because there's a lot more confrontation in that part. We already have enough confrontation, then you add to it by throwing zoning into the mix, you know. So I was zoning administrator there, but we got kind of burned out on just the living things weren't really that good. You know, moving back and coming back and forth a lot. We always had to go out here and see family, and it just wasn't good. So I decided to interview and start trying to interview in Arizona, and I interviewed in Clarkdale and Chino Valley on the same day. But it was very fascinating. I went to Clarkdale and liked it there. Thought it was a little too small, so I decided I really didn't want to take it. But then I went to Chino Valley, and I showed up for the interview, and I went to the office, and I look at the front door. There's a sign saying that the executive session for the night had been canceled. Nobody was there. I show up for the interview, and nobody's there. So I get a hold of the police department, which, you know, and find out how to get a hold of the town clerk. She comes over and tells me, "Oh, didn't they get a hold of you? We canceled the interview. We hired somebody." And here I am coming out for the interview. You know, it's crazy. So, but the fascinating part of that story comes out actually later when I was in Wickenburg. So, anyway, I come back out and I interview for Eloy and Wickenburg in the same day. And I didn't like it in Eloy particularly, so I was able to pick Wickenburg, and it's really nice there. I mean, I actually like Wickenburg. I don't have any bad memories about Wickenburg at all. I was there for 4 years, but I was there about 6 or 8 months, and I get a call from a gentleman who represented himself as a councilman in Chino Valley, and he says to me, you know, that the guy they hired, they wanted to fire him. This is the guy they hired instead of me. Well, it turns out their advertisement said they wanted somebody with Southwestern experience. They wanted somebody who had worked in an active management area for groundwater management, which I had for 12 years at Buckeye. Well, they hired this guy out of Michigan or something to come in. And it turned out that, well, he had some rather seedy things in his background. I don't know all the details, but they decided they wanted to get rid of him. He gets into a fight with the police chief, and just everything went ugly on him. So I always thought, you know, if they'd have hired me, they wouldn't have had all that grief, you know. Because I wasn't into any of that stuff. You know, I was a professional in the business. You know, I want to go run towns. Is what I wanted to do.
So did you consider leaving Wickenburg to go to Chino?
No, they didn't. No, Well, that same year they had like a recall, and almost all the council members were shown the door because of hiring this guy. So it turned out to be, you know, I didn't want to play.
You were lucky.
Yeah, I consider myself lucky.
You were lucky that door was closed that day.
Absolutely. And so
when you went into Wickenburg, what was going on there? What kind of growth were they having in 1998 that they saw you as the attractive candidate?
Well, I think they saw me as the attractive candidate because I had a lot of Arizona experience and was somebody who really wanted to get back to Arizona, was really eager to get back. And that, you know, that kind of rubs off on people. They sense that eagerness, and, you know, they decide they want you to come. So I went there, and probably one of the biggest issues I had while I was there was the bypass. We started a study for that bypass in January of 1999 that didn't conclude until July of 2002, 3.5-year study, and ended up picking a 2.5-mile bypass, which has cost well over $30 million to build. So it was that was a big thing for the community. There was an organization there called BOOT, and it stood for Bypass Out of Town. But there, of course, a lot of them went around in boots, and they wanted to run this 26-mile bypass all the way around the west side of Vulture Mountain, and, you know, just almost an impossible thing to get done cost-wise and everything else. And it just took 3.5 years to get things settled to have it where it is today, which really makes quite a bit of sense if you've been there lately.
Talk a little bit about the eventual shape that it took.
Well, I think it's good. It took just the west side of the ACMA River there, and they put in roundabouts at each end of it to connect into the town. I was there 4 or 5 months ago, coming back from San Francisco to see my son, who's up there now. And we decided to drive that way from Kingman on down, because we had to go to the valley on the way back. And we went through, it's a great situation. It turned out really good. While I was there, again, you get involved in the water and sewer and all that kind of stuff. Those are always big issues. And Wickenburg's outside of the AMA, so, you know, they can do what they want. Wickenburg is very fortunate, has tremendous groundwater reserves. And it's in well positioned for that sort of thing.
Now, this is the first community, it seems to me, that you've been involved with that is reliant more on tourism.
Very much so. Wickenburg
So
has...
how does that affect how you would make your decisions and run your
Well,
your
you
town?
want to be accommodating to people. So that's one of the things you try to do is make all your services. You have to be used to people coming in and asking questions. You know, in Heston, Kansas, nobody comes to City Hall except if they want to have business. You know, in Buckeye in those days, nobody did either, you know. But you have all kinds of people wanting to know this and that. And, you know, Gold Rush days there, whenever that happens, it's probably just happened. Whenever that happens, though, everybody that lives there that isn't involved in Gold Rush wants to be out of there because it becomes swarming with people. And it's very hard for locals. They just don't like it, most of the locals. But while I was there, I became president of the Lions Club, and I got involved in all sorts of activities, you know, of that nature there. And in fact, I didn't mention that when I was in Buckeye, I was in the Rotary Club for 12 years there, served as president twice. Some of that stuff is relevant, I guess. I don't know. To what?
So talk a little bit about the economy that supports Wickenburg.
Well,
What you had to do to change the way you would administer the city to support a place so different from Heston and Buckeye.
The good thing about Wickenburg is it has some advantages that some places just don't have. It has, Arizona Public Service provides electric there, except for about a 1 square mile of the old town site, which we used to call the hole in the donut. The town runs that utility system. Well, the town doesn't run it, it contracts with Arizona Public Service, at least it did when I was there, to actually operate the system. But even though it had access, it probably still does, to cheap power from Hoover and Parker Davis dams, it kept the rates in its portion pretty similar to the rates in the rest of town, so there'd be no commercial advantages or disadvantages. Well, that resulted in about a $2 million surplus every year for the town to spend. So Wickenburg had plenty of money because of that happenstance. And then, of course, it has a great winter visitor population that are there, that come in, and they spend a lot of money. It has, during the winter months, it has many tourism events going on. And, you know, there were, I don't know if there still are, but there are some arguments between the Chamber of Commerce and the town over things. The Chamber always is looking at wanting to do certain things just to promote, you know, their members and all that. And the town always has to have things done in the proper way, you know. And so there's natural antagonisms there between those. But I always got along really well with the Chamber of Commerce, partly because Julie Brooks, who's the chamber director there, had been chamber manager in Buckeye when I was there. So we were good friends. We got along just fine. And, you know, everything went good. And she'd tell me what certain officials were doing wrong, and I'd try to straighten them out. You know, we would get together and work things out. So it went very well. They had a former city administration there prior to mine, about 5 years prior to mine, had been totally hostile to the Chamber of Commerce, and there was a constant battle there. And they were pretty happy that they had me that was not hostile. I was trying to make everything work together. You know, I didn't want arguments. I mean, that doesn't help anybody. I mean, you're trying to have a community that's working together and prospering. You can't have these little arguments. I mean, they're just goofy to me. And so I was always trying to referee that stuff. I saw myself as a referee of a lot of those things.
Talk with us a little bit about that, seeing yourself as a referee. How did that play out?
A lot of times it would play out with various council factions, you know, that would want to do certain things. Or you'd have issues like I was explaining, they wanted to get rid of a police chief and didn't know how to do it back in Heston, Kansas. And basically I gave them the solution to do that. So we have to come up with creative ideas to help things along like that. You know, creative partnerships, that's important in the city management business. Like getting together with Maricopa County to build the city hall there. That sort of stuff. The council members,
the trouble with council members in general, and myself not included in this, because if I get elected, I'm not going to be like that. But they're very successful in, making widgets or selling insurance or, running a cruise travel business or something. And they think that translates just naturally, into, well, I'll be great. I know all about cities too. But of course, you don't run a business like you run a city or town. They always used to tell us, well, why don't you just run it like a business? And my answer to people like that was, well, you make me a dictator of your town and I'll run it as a business. Otherwise, I can't. I mean, we can run the business end of it, which is the buying and selling, buying things and the operational part of it, but you can't run the policy end of it as a business. It just won't work. The only way it's run as a business is if it is a dictatorship. And that's where somebody's telling you what you have to do. And that's a hard thing for people that are non-governmental people to really realize, because when they ran their business making widgets, they made all the decisions. They didn't rely upon anybody else.
So did you see yourself as sort of in an educational role to help bring people along to understand how to run city government, or was it more of a personality thing where you would nudge people along?
It's more nudging people along because so many of them are just...
Got it.
She has it, okay. So many of them are just hard-headed.
Yeah.
I'm successful and, I know I can do this just like I can do anything else. They don't go into it with the attitude of I've got a lot to learn because it's a different arena. Mm-hmm. And I already know that, so that will be very helpful to me. Because I already understand the other side. Mm-hmm. If I should make it to the dark side, I already understand the other side.
Right. Talk a little bit about how you would manage to be both innovative and allow towns to try new things and support different ways of doing things, taking risks, but also being conservative enough not to make big mistakes.
Well, in my opinion, there aren't really too many risks that you should be taking when you've got when you're looking at being in a position of fiduciary responsibility for something that represents 10, 15,000 people. I mean, it's something that they rely upon for the town's going to be here providing parks and recreation, water, sewer, whatever it is, street maintenance, forever and ever. So you can't be too risk-taking. Where you get I think on the edge a little bit is coming up with creative ways of doing things. Like, for example, when I was in Buckeye, we didn't have the money to finance the $200 and some thousand water lines for, to run out to the Walmart plant. So I got together with a gentleman who for years and years and years did nothing but figure out how to do creative bond issues. And, we put together this package that they allowed us to actually do a lease purchase of our own water lines. Some bondholder somewhere said, hey, well, Fred Roosevelt is who it is. You've probably heard of him.
I've heard the name, yeah.
He was for years and years the premier bond attorney in Arizona. Well, we came up with this plan since I didn't have the money that we were able to pay for this over 3 or 4 years. And he came up with a creative way of making this work. So it was stuff like that you try. That's where you get on the edge in this business. You don't get way out on the edge and taking huge risks. I mean, you just can't, and because it's a settled situation. It's not a venture capital situation. It's not a .com, thing or anything. You have to make sure that the services and facilities are there for the people. And you can't take a big risk when you have to provide those.
But even with each of these, every place that you've talked about, there's a certain amount of risk that you're taking because you're even just infrastructure moves and
well, some of those are kind of risky. Building,
attracting a Walmart. What does that mean? You think it's going to be a very positive thing, but
well, it actually turned out to be everything totally positive for Buckeye because it was built a couple miles out of town, but annexed into town. But it never felt like it was in town. It didn't affect anybody's neighborhood. I mean, it was just an ideal situation. So I didn't see that as a risk at all because I knew that here's a 500-person employer. I mean, it's going to be incredible. I mean, how can you go wrong with that? Well, that was easy.
Well, that's a kind of interesting thing because when you move from place to place, some folks have talked a lot about the importance of taking a long time up front to get to know a place, the building up a trust and knowledge of the particular.
Well, that's great, but you also have to go with the idea that you may only be there for 3, 4, 5
Exactly,
years.
so it's a little
So you
different.
can't take too long up front.
Right.
You know, you got to dive right, and some issues are right there for you to deal with right away when you come in.
Right.
You know, you've got to dig right in. And we had a big issue here in Payson. We'll kind of segue into Payson a little
Okay.
bit. That a company up here called the Doorstop, which makes basically cabinets and so on, and they're up in the air park, industrial air park. Well, it's zoned properly for them, but unfortunately, right next door to them is an air park where people live. And so there's this huge noise issue that took a couple years to sort out. Didn't even get sorted out while I was there. Got sorted out last year, I think, before they settled all the lawsuits over it. But, and that's one of the biggest problems you run into are these zoning issues, where land people did not have the foresight to realize that any industrial next to any residential is going to, at some day, be a problem. It just is. You got to have a buffer. And in fact, we had one of those problems in Heston, Kansas, where a mini storage was located right next to a residential neighborhood. And this guy decides that every now and then he's going to have sales for the contents. And people just come tromping all over through flowers and everything to get there. And, oh, you talk about a mess.
Well, you're having a big one of those today here in Payson. Did you know that?
What's that?
Well, a big, huge garage sale. It looks like it's from a storage place.
Oh, it might be, yeah.
But it's not next to a residential neighborhood.
Well, that's good.
Yeah,
That's good.
yeah. The zoning seems to work on that account.
Well, but we do have that problem up here. So, and here I come in again, every place you go seems to be factionalized for some reason. And when I first get here, there's a couple of factions.
So what brings you from Wickenburg to Payson?
Well, here was a chance to move back to the mountains, which we really wanted to do. And that's my wife and I both wanted to move to the mountains, get out of the valley, get out of the heat. Wickenburg's nice, but it's not the valley, but it's still warm. It's still much warmer than here. And we really wanted to get up here. So, plus, I saw a chance to go to a bigger town where I'd actually have department heads. Here, the town actually has a chief financial officer and had a human resources manager and, public works directors and all those different things, and even a full-time town clerk, so you wouldn't have to deal with all those issues. You could concentrate on, the one thing that you know how to do. And, but you still run into difficulties with people. In fact, I did not go out of here on my feet completely. When I ended up retiring here, it was a forced retirement, but it just happened to be fine. I was ready to go. They gave me a 7-month severance, and now the guy that engineered my ouster, he lost in the last election. So, what goes around comes around, I guess. I don't know.
So what were some of the issues that you inherited when you came here to Payson?
Well, the biggest thing that's happening in Payson, the biggest argument that people had, or the biggest cause for fight, was growth, anti-growth. During the mid to late 90s and up into the early 21st century, Payson was growing really dramatically. And it just scared a lot of people because of the fast growth. And actually, I don't blame them. I much prefer Payson to Prescott Valley. And part of it is we don't have to deal with anywhere near. To drive from Dewey to downtown Prescott is a chore anymore, if you've tried it lately. It's quite a chore. But to get up here, you found it really easy. You have a couple traffic lights. We have a couple of big weekends a year, the major holiday weekends, when it's a real challenge to come and go up here. But the locals all know how to get around that. So if it's Labor Day weekend, we don't go certain ways. We know how to get around it. But you can't avoid it in some of those places. But people up here, there's a large percentage of people that are afraid to see that kind of thing happening. They don't want this to turn into Prescott or Prescott Valley or somewhere like that. And I don't blame them, really. So there was a big growth, no growth battle. And the no growthers took over in 2006. And then the growthers took over back in 2008, I guess. But the terms are really very loose, because even the growthers up here are not in favor of high growth. Nobody up here really wants to see us turn into anything like that. So,
Were there particular issues that came up, attraction of a big company or?
well, the doorstop was a huge thing
The
because a
doorstop.
lot of people thought that was great, you know, but then many others said, well, why do we want all those minimum wage jobs? And, you know, and while I was here, the entire 5 years I was here, I was trying to get a resort conference center up here. I mean, think about that. I mean, it's just such a natural. You know, right now we have so many people that come up here. Now, this is kind of a campaign speech almost, but you don't care. You have so many people that come up here, they stop here and they head on up to the rim. And but on weekends, a lot of them come up here and they stay in the hotels. Summer weekends, the hotels are full. Wednesday afternoon, there's 2 people in a hotel in July here. Okay, so if you have a resort conference center, you know that everything from the Archaeological Society to the Zoological Society is going to want to come up here. It's an hour and a half from the valley. It's the easiest ride of any of the resort areas. Believe me, you know.
And the most beautiful, yeah.
And the most beautiful, the trip up here is certainly much easier than going to Prescott. It's a lot quicker than going to Flagstaff or Pine Top Lakeside. So you get a resort. My idea was always, well, let's build a resort that has a 200-unit hotel, but it has room for 500 or 600 people to have meetings. So then what happens is the City Clerks Association decides to come up here and have a conference, let's say. So they come up here on a Tuesday afternoon, and they stay till Friday morning, whatever it is, and they're gone. Well, Tuesday to Friday, you got all that occupancy in the hotels. Plus, you're not going to fit all of them in the 200-unit hotel that's the conference headquarters. The other 300 people are going to stay in all the other hotels. It's just going to, it's such a natural to me. And so I've been pushing for that all the way along. Plus, if you talk to the Chamber of Commerce here, they get calls, they get half a dozen calls a week. Well, we want to have a conference up there. Where do we go? And of course, there's nowhere to go. The tribe has a sort of a facility, but they only have a 40-unit hotel. And a lot of people don't want to have conferences at casinos for whatever, they just don't want to. But yet the casino is also an entertainment thing that is valuable here. People come here for a conference looking for something to do. They're going to do what your friend's doing. They're going to look for antique shopping. And the private sector here will wise up and they'll find stuff for those people to do when they know they're going to be here.
Gotcha.
So that's one of my big campaign things. I've been saying that, but I tried to do that while I was town manager. And we have a 36-acre parcel on the way into town that the town owns that we were trying to work out a hotel conference center there. And I had a guy who was mayor at the time tell me that, well, I'm against a conference center for Payson because I don't want to see happen to Payson what happened to Flint, Michigan. I'm saying to myself, what possible comparison can you draw between Payson and Flint, Michigan? They built a hotel conference center in downtown Flint, Michigan, and it goes belly up. Duh. You know, that didn't take a rocket scientist, did it? To figure out that was going to happen? You build one here, it ain't going belly up.
Yeah.
Because they're going to be busy. I mean, they'll be busy with 30, 40 conferences a year in a facility like that. Easy.
So what were some of the issues that you were able to accomplish or work on here that you hadn't had experience elsewhere? I know that you created a citizens, what's it called, a leadership academy.
Yeah, I started that one here. Although I'm not the first guy that started that, we modeled it after Casa Grande,
Okay.
which had done it 1 year before us. But yeah, I started that, I don't know who told you that, but we did start that from scratch. Did I put that on my resume or something, or?
I heard that, I think, from Kathy Conley.
Oh, yeah, we started this, what we called the Leadership Academy. Basically, it's a training, it's a local government 101. You know, one of the things that people our educational system lacks, you learn all about U.S. Constitution, Arizona Constitution, but there's hardly a whisper about how local governments run. And yet, what is the most important, government in most people's lives daily? It's their local government, the one that sends the fire trucks out and the police, and they have to get their business licenses from or a building permit, that when they turn the water tap on, it's there. But people don't know anything about local government. It's amazing, there's some kind of a disconnect. And we tried to do something with that through ACMA back in the 90s. We never could get anywhere. Tried to get ASU to get involved in it, to where we would actually develop some coursework for the high schools in local government, because they just don't get it. And it's silly. It's a real lack in our educational system. So anyway, we started this academy, Arizona Public Service, as a partner on it. And I think they're on about their 7th year now, maybe their 8th year of doing it. And it still gets 15 to 20 people and takes them through this 3-month course, and they learn, you know, they have sections on the community development department, the police department, fire, library, parks.
Do
They
they
learn-
eventually perhaps become interested in running for city
They
council?
do, in fact, one of the graduates is one of my opponents in this election. There's only 4 of us running for 3 seats. So, you know, like I say, one of them is, she, after graduating from that, went on to council, and many of them have gone on to serve on boards and commissions. And they have a lot better grounding in the way things operate from having gone through the local government course.
So talk with us a little bit, because as we drove up, we saw signs all over, and one in front of your house about running for town council. And of course, you're building on your experience.
Right.
Talk with us a little bit about what is the difference between running a city and being on city council, being a manager as opposed to having some sort of political ambition.
Well, there's an
And
analogy that I
serving
can.
in a different way.
There's an analogy that I can give you, because having served as chairman of all those committees, being a committee chairman at MAG is like being a council member. Because the staff members at MAG and the League of Cities, they're doing all the pick and shovel work. They're doing all the input, and you're just trying to make the policy decisions. So I have that, but I learned how that operates differently. Of course, I understand the difference between policy and administration. And never the twain shall meet, you know, I mean, they should not meet. You know,
That's a really hard thing for people to understand.
it is.
So I'd love to hear from your perspective and your career, how you're so clear about that.
Well,
And
the reason I'm clear about it is because ICMA makes it, I think, pretty clear. You know, that when you're in one role, you operate in one way. If I'm an administrator, somebody else is making policy decisions, which I may have participated in the development of the outcomes, but somebody that's involved in administering it has to carry it out whether they like it or not. I mean, you know, and many times we didn't like what they'd end up voting in. You know, I mean, certain actions they take, we didn't think it was the right thing. But you carry it out. You just do it. And you have to learn the difference. And so if I make it to the dark side, I understand I'll then be making a policy decision. But who's got a larger background in policy decisions that might be running for an office like this? Not very many.
here's that thing about his oh, thanks. So talk with us now then about, you served as the manager, and
Right.
then you retired, you've lived here. Talk with us a little bit about what it means to live in a community and see what goes on and how the place is run, and what made you think that you wanted to run for council?
Well, it wasn't my idea originally. There was a lot of people I know in the community that were saying, you know, you really ought to do that, you know, because you got the background, and they know I have the temperament for that sort of thing. And of course, the staff would think that I'd be totally their advocate, which you can't always be. You know, no matter how much they may like you better than somebody else, you're still going to have to make decisions they're not necessarily going to like. You know, it's just the way life is. But I just think I've got enough background. I'm prepared to help make decisions at that level because of all the knowledge I have from all the years of, and plus I know some stuff that isn't going to work. People are going to propose ideas that are just not going to, I know are going to be totally all wet, and I'm going to have to tell them so. You know, that's just not going to work. You know, and I can't think of specific examples,
Yeah.
but they're going to have, you know, and they're going to think something's just a great idea. You know, but it's going to be something we've already tried and found out it didn't work. You know, just as an example, kind of a small example, when I first got here, there was a councilman who said, "Oh, I'm going to have these meetings with my constituents. You know, every Wednesday afternoon at 2:00, they're going to come in." Well, they don't. You know, he tried that. He'd get one or two people dropping by, and after a couple of months of trying this thing and beating his head against the wall, it just didn't work. You know, and I could have told him that. You know, it's not going to work. Not in a small town. It might work in Phoenix, you know, where you got enough people that would do it, but it just doesn't work here. That's one of the things that sounds great. And then we had these quarterly, this guy, same guy, he also wanted these quarterly meetings on topics, and we're gonna get all these people to come in, we're gonna televise it on local TV, and you go up there and we do a topic on, say, water, the Blue Ridge Reservoir or something, and 10 people will show up for the thing. You know, I mean, what use is that? It just doesn't work. I mean, it sounds good, but you gotta get the people there, and they don't come. You know, there are most people that are out there in the general public, they're interested in their particular issue, and they, you know, they want everything else to run smooth, but they don't take a big interest in it. You can't get them to show up at a budget meeting. I mean, it all sounds ideal that, oh, we're gonna have this great budget meeting and all people are gonna come in. Well, if I'm thinking about giving money to your organization, you're gonna be there. But if I'm not, you're not gonna be there. You're not gonna care.
So what do you see as some of the key issues that are gonna challenge and give opportunity to Payson in the future, the kind of direction you see it should go?
You know, I talked to you about the conference center and resort already, but you know, Arizona State University is considering a branch campus up here. And that, there's a 300-acre parcel on the east side of town that's really available, and they're working on that right now, and that's a tremendous opportunity. If we could get a branch ASU campus up here, I mean, it's an incredible economic development thing, and people don't realize it. You know, in fact, a lot of the people around here that are kind of against it, they say, well, it's just gonna bring a bunch of hooligan kids up here and make trouble and all this stuff. And of course, I know from having worked in university town before, Heston, Kansas, that you don't get, most of them are not gonna cause you a lot of trouble. They're gonna give you trouble a couple, 3, 4 times a year at certain party events, and the rest of the time they're not going to. You know, and then they bring in the professors that are gonna live here and work at the college. They upgrade, and the educational opportunities just escalate, the cultural opportunities escalate, and there's a lot of money spent in the community by a university. I mean, you gotta feed people. You gotta provide housing and stuff for them. So there's gonna be a lot of opportunities there to fill up vacant houses. It's just an incredibly good economic opportunity. So that's the thing that's being worked on and has been worked on, and I wholeheartedly support that adventure as well. And of course, I'm the resort conference center guy too, you know, I'm talking about that all the time. How, you know, what a good thing that would be.
Right. How about just in terms of other things to promote tourism?
Well, we have a director right now, Parks and Recreation and Tourism Promotion Director. He has both titles. That Payson used to at one time be the festival capital of Arizona, it was called, back in the late 80s, early 90s, it was known as that. Well, a lot of those kind of fell away. And, you know, again, it's the same thing as tourism. If you put on a fiddler's festival up here, and you got places for people to stay, they're going to come. You put on a blues show, they're going to come from the valley. I mean, everybody wants to get out of there when it's 110 degrees, you know, and it's easy to get up here and find it's only 95 and just love it. So that's, you know, I think another area that we need to emphasize more.
How do you think about how unusual is it or not that a city council member has served as a town or city manager?
Well, there's a couple I know of. There's a gentleman that used to be the town manager of Paradise Valley by the name of Oscar Butt. And I don't know if he's in any of your, if he's still around or anything like that, but I'll stop it just a minute. Come on in. Anyway, Oscar Butt did that. And then another friend of mine named Jess Vella, he was at one time the community services director in the city of Avondale. He moved to Somerton and bought himself a mobile home park when he retired and went on to be mayor. You may know Jess or heard of his name.
No, I don't know that name.
Yeah. And he's probably been retired now for quite a while, but he did that back in the 80s.
So have you talked to them?
Yeah, Jess was.
How?
No, the others I haven't talked to. I haven't seen Oscar Butt in 20 years probably. But Jess, I used to talk to him about it, and he said, well, it's a transition, you know, but he really enjoyed it. Didn't have any trouble with it. He was a pretty successful mayor there, I guess, for quite a while.
So if you thought things were running really smoothly here in Payson, would you be as tempted as you are to run? Or
no, I think things actually are running fairly smoothly. I don't want to institute wholesale changes. I just feel like, you know, I've got some background that can be drawn upon, and Payson's home, and I want to do something. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. We've interviewed one other person who was kind of in a similar situation, but they didn't really want to serve, but they felt that they had to because
No, I
they
don't feel
saw
like
things were going
I
wrong.
have to. I don't think, I don't have that
It's
attitude
not to
at all.
rectify a situation, it's really
No.
to continue to serve, but in
Yeah.
another way.
Sure,
Gotcha.
I'm not, I don't have to do anything revolutionary,
Gotcha.
to be here. And, and I guess some people do feel like they have to because things are going so far south, but, I don't think, that's the case here. I just want, it's like being in a Rotary Club or something, you want to serve.
It's a continuation of your service.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, I just have a couple other questions, and then I would want to leave it open to you to anything else you want to
Okay,
add.
sure.
Could you just talk a little bit about, maybe either some of the events or some of the people that had the biggest influence on you as a town manager?
Well, certainly, we already talked about Ernie Kleinschmidt. That was a tremendous impact on me. And then, just seemed like things just fell into place. Like I was, quote unquote, I don't mean to make this in any religious or spiritual sense, but it seemed like I was, quote unquote, destined to do what I did for those years because everything just seemed to fall into place, at the right time. Like I get the internship at Guadalupe and it builds into something. I get the job in Prescott Valley and it works. And, things just seem to segue naturally, I guess. Events just seem to go the right direction. So I guess that's it mainly. Other people that had a lot of influence on me in terms of government, certainly Jack Tobalski and Kathy Conley would be two of them. Dennis Smith, you probably know from MAG. He's been a big, of course, he and I are pretty much contemporaries age-wise, but, we used to always talk about different stuff in government.
So do you think young people who are entering the field of public administration could have a career similar to yours now?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I think the cities and towns of at least Arizona, a lot of them are in that position where you could do that. You could start off right now and you could go to work in Somerton or something and then maybe move on up to Yuma or, as an example, you could work in Star Valley out here and decide you want to move on up to Payson and you can still make a career. I think right now, this moment is probably not a good one, but I think, when the economy turns around, which inevitably it does, things will be right for people to do that. So I would certainly encourage people to go and get a public administration degree. And if you like to be just a little bit of a gypsy, I guess, like to move around, that opportunity's there. Before I retired here, I had a chance. I almost interviewed in Cortez, Colorado for a job, and they wanted me to come up there, but my wife really didn't want to. She says, I don't want to move, and let's don't go. So, I did an interview, and it just did, I just didn't do it. But I probably could have got the job. It was a community in many ways similar to Payson in terms of, tourism and things of that nature.
Okay, I think I've asked you everything I need to, but I certainly want to give you an opportunity. Anything else you want to add? Or?
Well, the only thing I can tell you what I'm doing now, we have a 10-year-old grandson that lives with us primarily, although his parents are in town, but he primarily lives with us for a lot of reasons I won't go into. And we have that, and I also have a DJ business on the side, Fred the DJ LLC. I do wedding receptions and anniversaries and stuff. And yes, I have the up-to-date music too. Anything from Nelly to all the hip hop and stuff like that I can play. So I do that as a kind of a hobby.
Right. Well,
And
when you have the conference resort,
yeah, well,
it's a great opportunity.
it would be a great opportunity, although it might be a conflict of interest. I don't know. I got to watch that. But I don't know if that'll ever
What
happen.
made you
anyway.
start
I had
the
people.
DJ business?
I've always been so knowledgeable about music that people used to ask me to do wedding receptions for them.
What
And
kind
I
of
would-
music do you like?
Oh, I like anything from, anything from Rock Around the Clock to The Cure. I don't care. I like modern stuff and old stuff and, it's just, I have a wide variety of taste and that helps, although I'm not really a big, huge hip hop fan mostly. But I can deal with Britney Spears when I have to and you know, that sort of thing. I like American Idol too. I watch that all the time. I think that's fascinating. I'm a junkie on American Idol. But then I substitute teach too at the high school. That only amounts to a couple days a month, but you know, it's just kind of a hobby to do that too. But it keeps you in touch with different people.
Sure.
I got involved in a project up there at the first of the year. The school had a problem, which a lot of them do. They had to put in a new fire alarm system, and everything didn't click along, and they wanted to open school, and the system wasn't in, so they had 6 of us as fire guards. We had to work up there for 3 weeks, just walking around, checking on stuff, and they had to have substitutes because you have to have the background check, you have to have the fingerprint card. You can't just go pull somebody off the street and come in and put them with kids, you know. So it was kind of a good deal. So I'm doing that,
Okay.
and you know, the Rotary Club, I'm president this year, so that keeps me busy. I'm going to be assistant governor next year.
And when's your election?
The election is March 9th, but it's an all-male. We always say M-A-I-L because we don't want people to think only men can run. But it's an all-male ballot. The ballots were sent out last Friday. So people, a lot of them, most of them have already voted, or a good share of
It
them
could
have already
already
voted.
be decided, and you don't know.
It could be, yeah. You don't know, have no idea. So then some people save their ballots till the very end and turn them in. The reason they went to that, they actually went to that in 2004 here, because you have to have like 5 precincts, and when you have all these precincts, you have to have 5 election boards, and anymore you have to have all these, you have to have them all handicapped accessible, you have to have interpreters on each one of them for Spanish language. It became really complicated. So, but the all-mail avoids all that.
Sure.
So they get mailed out and brought back in, and it's all counted by computer on that night of March 9th. We'll
So
find
how do
out.
you think the town manager's gonna feel having a council member know more than he does about his job?
Well, I don't think, it's actually a she here now, but I don't think, you know, she'll feel that way necessarily. And again, you know, there's some people that might think I'm out to get somebody because of the way I went out, but I'm not, you know, I don't care. You know, I mean, you move on, life's too short to hold grudges and stuff.
So
So,
you seriously have always expected that things are very cyclical,
They are.
everything that you've mentioned, you've talked a lot about cycles and,
well, things are cyclical. That's
Yeah.
just the way it goes, you know,
Yeah.
especially among these
Your experience.
different groups, you know, like there'll be a growth faction that'll run something for a while, and then a no growth will take over. And it's just the way it is. And these other communities, they have these factions based on different things, maybe personality conflicts, or maybe we were against incorporation and you were for it. And so we're at odds still, even though this reality of the town is there, you know. So I don't know, that's I think kind of interesting. Yeah, cycles are very important. We have weather cycles. You know, here in Payson, we had in January we had over 7 inches of precipitation. We got a 12-inch snowfall in the middle of the month, and you know, of course, that only translates into about 1 inch of rain, the same as 1 inch of rainfall. But you know, everybody's worried about droughts and all that stuff, and you know, all of a sudden it all turns around again. And so I'm not one of these that's really worried about anything long term. I think Earth takes care of itself pretty good in the long run.
well, it
Seems
sounds like
to.
you've taken care of a lot of towns.
We've had a lot of
And-
interesting
and we-
times.
And we look
there.
forward to the outcome of your election.
Well, I suppose that'll be
We'll
relevant to this
We'll
whole.
be checking the news after the
This will
night.
be relevant to the whole thing, huh?
Yeah,
to some extent.
absolutely. I didn't ask you about some of the cultural institutions in Payson that support your tourism, the Zane Grey Cabin and,
Oh yeah,
that
well
kind of
there actually was a group that rebuilt the Zane Grey cabin. That was burned down in the 1990 Dude Fire, and
I have to ask you about fire too.
yeah, fires is really a fascinating thing here.
Yeah.
One of the things that
Are you still rolling, right?
I'm rolling.
Okay, sorry. 'cause I
one of the
totally
things we've
forgot.
done, in fact, that's one of the big issues we had to deal with was the bark beetle infestations and the fire issues, and building a fire break around the community. In fact, that got built first in about 2006. It's like a 100-yard or more wide thinning all the way around the community. We had a huge scare with the willow fire in 2004, which you could see it burning on the horizon over there from our house here, and you know, it never got within, it got within 4 miles of the town. And so Up here, forest management is a huge issue, and people up here have all really learned, or most of them have learned that, we have too many trees. And the key to it is just getting back in there and doing some thinning,
Thin it out.
and not logging in the traditional sense, but logging in the modern sense of let's thin the forest. There's too many trees. And that really affects the groundwater availability too, and the stream flow. If you can get rid of a lot of the trees that are just really superfluous. If you went back to the late 19th century and in the time machine and walked around here, these forests here were park-like. There were 8 or 10 big trees, and then you have a few small trees, and then every 3 to 5 years, it'd come through and burn out the small stuff, and the big ones would survive. And it was, and then we've let it get to 300 and 400 trees an acre when you ought to have maybe 20 or 30. So that was a big issue while I was here too, huge.
And didn't Governor Napolitano, wasn't she instrumental in passing the changes in forest management?
Well, I don't know really if that's what happened. It was more, the town worked with the Forest Service directly, and they came up with some money to do it. The town had to match that to get it going. And one of the neighborhoods out here, we have a couple of gated communities on the east side, Chaparral Pines and the Rim Club. They actually put up their share of the thinning along their borders as a contribution. Star Valley put up money for theirs, and if you drive out there, you can, at certain places, you can see how this forest thinning really worked. These so-called fire breaks. And so that's, forest management's come a long ways. I mean, it used to be, we put them all out. Now it's something we should
Controlled.
burn, and, it's just a different mindset. But I think things over the next 15, 20 years, if we keep managing in the new way, everything will look a lot better after 15 or 20 more years of this.
Another cycle
Yeah, another cycle.
in our understanding.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that it?
Okay, thank you. Mike McNulty,
McNulty, yeah.
because he saw him as kind of akin to your career in terms of doing a lot of town management.
Yeah, I think he did a lot of that. I knew Mike not as well as some did, but I remember stopping to visit with him in Paradise Valley one time. And they didn't have a home rule option there, and he had like $13 million in the bank he couldn't spend. Everybody was trying to get him to do street improvements, and he'd have to tell them